The Problem of Nature by Giovanni Gentile. Having posited a purely ideal dialectic, and a logos distinct from mind or thought thinking, which is the consciousness of it, the road lay open to Hegel to deduce mind from the logos by passing through nature. For, by conceiving the dialectic of thing-thought as pure thinkable, he had found a way of conceiving nature dialectically, for nature is a thing thought, and not a thinking. But it proves to be only a road painted on a wall, for he kept open the possibility of conceiving nature dialectically only because he had not yet discovered the true dialectic, and continued to use the old, unserviceable Platonic dialectic. When we make dialectic coincide with thought, we cannot, as we saw in the last chapter, even propose the problem of the dialectic of nature. It becomes an absurdity. If, in place of the false conception of history, which opposes history to the mind which thinks it, we have been able to indicate and put in its place the true conception of history, and if that dialectical concept eliminates the opposition and reveals the infinite unity of mind consolidated in its actuality, then the criticism we are now bringing against the dialectical concept of nature digs still deeper the abyss which yawns between mind and the concept of a reality which is resistant to all dialectical thinking. Granted the dialectical nature of mind, a limitation of its dialectic seems to carry with it a limitation of the reality of mind, and so to force us to deny to it that infinity which we declared immanent in the concept of mind. Hence the problem arises. What is this nature which stands confronting the mind, and is not susceptible of being presented dialectically? What is this nature which the mind finds outside itself as its own antecedent? Until we reply to this question, it is clearly impossible to maintain our fundamental affirmation of the infinite unity of mind. Before we can say what nature is, we must first know whether the nature meant is thought of as general or universal, or as individual. Plato, following Socrates, who first originated the clear distinction between the general and the individual, was induced by the speculative transcendental tendency of his philosophy to think of nature as general, and so he turned the immediacy and positiveness of natural reality into the idea of the nature. The true horse is not for him the single, particular, individual horse, but the species horse, not, of course, using the term in the empirical meaning of the naturalist. It is horseness, and he tells us that it provoked the mirth of his opponent Antisthenes. Plato could not conceive otherwise a nature which could be an object of science, or which could simply be without an idea. But such a conception of nature fell under the criticism which Aristotle brought to bear on the Platonic transcendence. The Platonic doctrine makes the individual inconceivable, and it was the individual which, pressing upon thought with the demand that it be taken in its full actuality, had generated the problem of the Socratic universal. For Aristotle, nature, in its opposition to thought, is posited as the unity of the form or idea with matter, its opposite, Plato's non-being. For Aristotle's substance is precisely the individual which is that unity. And with Aristotle, nature begins to be opposed to the universality of the idea, or of the pure thought with its own individuality, which brings the incarnation of the form into the matter, an incarnation which is the actualizing of a power due to the realization of the form itself, of which, in the matter, there is nothing but the abstract and inert possibility. The concept of the individual has great importance in the Aristotelian philosophy. It affirms the necessity of overcoming the abstract position of the idea, which is actual thinking as thought. But rather than a concept, We should say it is a demand, or that it is the aspiration of the Aristotelian thought to attain the immanent concept of the universal. The concept, indeed, is not attained, and it could not be attained so long as philosophy sought reality, and the reality of the individual, in thing thought, instead of in thinking. It is shown, indeed, that the individual we would distinguish from the idea is distinguished as the process of realization from the reality which the idea will be. But this process of realization, as we have seen, from the Aristotelian standpoint, which coincides with the Platonic in making the reality thought of a presupposition of the thinking, is inconceivable, except in so far as it is yet to begin, potency, matter, or is already exhausted, act, form. So that, in analyzing the individual, it is necessary first to find the two elements which constitute it, and there is no possibility of understanding their relation, for it is just the process of actualization of the individual itself, and this is precisely the nature it would affirm in opposition to the transcendental reality of the pure Platonic ideas. The 1,000 years' history of the problem concerning the principium individuationis, which had its rise in the Aristotelian concept of the individual, serves to prove how insuperable were the difficulties to which Aristotelianism was condemned, unwilling to stop at the abstract universal of Platonism, and yet completely unable to seek the immanence of the universal, or rather its individuality, where alone it is possible to find it, in the reality which is not the antecedent of thought, but thinking itself. The interpreters of Aristotle asked themselves, of the two elements which constitute the individual, matter and form, which must be considered the principle of individualization? For if, as Plato had conceived, the form is universal, the matter likewise must itself be universal, as that from which all the forms which are displayed in the endless series of the individuals, however disparate themselves, issue, a matter which in itself has none of the determinations which are realized in it by the intervention of the forms, so that form and matter, the one as much as the other taken by itself, each excludes the very possibility of any determination or individualization. Individuality arises from their meeting. But in this meeting, which of the two determines the indeterminate, making it individual? If we start with the abstract original duality of matter and form as given, it is impossible that we should find the ground of their unity, or the true principium individui. Giordano Bruno, in the fuller maturity of the Renaissance, saw this clearly, yet he could only do what Aristotle, coming after Plato, had done before: turn and affirm the need of unity. It was not given even to Bruno to perceive what he called the point of union. He remained, even to the end, at the standpoint of ancient philosophy, imagining reality as a presupposition of thought, a standpoint from which it is impossible to conceive movement and development. For, if we start with unity, unity remains abstract and unproductive, unable to give the ground of duality. And if we start with duality, the duality cannot but be eternal duality, because it cannot but be identical with itself, and therefore incapable of being unified. The medieval philosophers started with duality, and inquired which of the two terms generates that unity which is the individual. They were divided into two opposite camps, and their conflict was interminable, since they found on the one side and on the other alike unchallengeable reasons, the one for maintaining that the principle of the individual is in the form, and the other for maintaining that it is in the matter. They opposed and contraposed thesis to antithesis, antithesis to thesis, without ever succeeding in extricating themselves from the antinomy. The problem is, in fact, insoluble, because whoever posits duality and then seeks to understand the relation of the two terms must, since it is not an a priori relation, that is, a relation on the existence of which each of the two terms depends, decide in favor of one of the two. Either he thinks matter is primordial and matter only, or he thinks form is primordial and form only. To think both matter and form as together is excluded by hypothesis of the duality, according to which each of the two terms is what it is without the other, and by itself excludes the other. Now, to think matter by itself is to think a pure indeterminateness, which cannot produce determination from itself, and which cannot, therefore, appear individualized, save by reason of its opposite, form, which will then be the individualizing principle. But this deduction is legitimate only so far as it admits the contrary. It is rendered possible, in fact, by the concept of the abstract matter, which supposes the concept of abstract form. For to deny the concept of abstract form would involve also the denial that matter is really indeterminate. And this is the very basis on which the deduction rests. Suppose, then, we begin by thinking of form by itself. Lo and behold, the very term, which from one aspect appeared the origin of determinateness, now, looked at from the opposite aspect, is transfigured into pure determinable, which is absolutely indeterminate. In its pure ideality, the form is the possibility of all particular individuals, and not any one of the particular individuals. It must be incorporated and determined as a single existent, but this incarnation cannot be a transformation and generation from within. There must intervene something which, precisely as Plato said, is the negation of the ideal, actually universal being. And then it is evident that the individualizing principle can only be in the matter, which is opposed to the form. Hence, the scales of the scholastics, leaning now to one side, now to the other, some affirming that the principium individui is the form, others that it is the matter, each with equal ground and reason, each shut in by the impossibility of definitely breaking down the arguments of the opposite side. There is one doctrine, however, which, though unjustifiable on the basis of scholasticism, brought into play a high speculative talent, that of Thomas Aquinas. This doctrine takes its stand not on matter abstractly conceived, quo modalibet accepta, but rather on matter conceived as having in itself a principle of determination, materia signata, matter impressed with signum, which implies a certain preadaptation to the form, a certain principle or beginning of it. An illogical doctrine, insofar as it framed the problem whether form or matter is the individualizing principle, it yet has the great merit that it substantially denies even the possibility of solving the problem without changing its terms. Practically, it amounts to a rejection of the problem, which, like all problems admitting of two contradictory solutions, or, as Kant would say, giving rise to antinomies, is wrongly stated. It must not be thought that the problem of the principle of individualization was abandoned with the disappearance of scholasticism, when the authority of Aristotle was shaken and modern philosophy entered on a new life. We have already shown that Bruno, notwithstanding his intense aspiration towards unity, never rose above the Aristotelian conception, and, were this the place, we might trace the history of the many attempts in the modern era which have been made to solve this famous problem. It involves the essential question of philosophy. It is not merely a theme for intellectual gymnastics, such as we are accustomed to consider most of the questions over which medieval philosophers grew impassioned. The form is fundamentally the idea of the world, its ground, its plan, the logos, God. And the matter is, in its turn, that obscure term which, irreducible to God's real essence, makes the world to be distinct from God, even though it be the actualizing of his thought. All who think this world, in whatever way they think it, see in it a design, an order, something rational, which renders it intelligible, insofar at least as it appears such. Galileo reduces the intelligibility of nature, which for him is the world itself in its totality, to mathematical relations, and these relations present themselves as laws, conceivable in themselves, independently of their verification in natural facts, as if there were a logic presiding over the working, or rather, over the realization of nature itself. Hegel constructed a complicated pure logic, by which the world is rendered intelligible to the philosopher, and this logic in its purer element, the logos, is posited before thought as the eternal plan, which is followed out in the world. It is impossible ever to see reality otherwise than by the light of an idea, which, once we conceive the reality as a positive and therefore contingent fact, must ideally work loose from that fact, and posit itself as a pure idea, and so oblige us to ask, how does it become fact? The question is not substantially different from that with which the principium individui is concerned. This supposes, as already noticed, and as it should now be clear, an original dualistic intuition. It could not be put in the monistic philosophies, which denied the transcendence of the ideal to the real, of God to the world, and therefore of the form to the matter. But a philosophy must do more than merely propose to restore unity and reject transcendence, if it would gain that absolute concept of immanence for which monism strives, that in which alone it is possible to be rid of the antinomy of the principle of individualization. Hegel, in this respect, passes ordinarily for a more immanentist philosopher than he really is. He is responsible for pantheism being identified with immanentism, and has become the prototype of the pantheists. Certainly, no one before him had made such mighty efforts to free reality from every shadow of a principle which transcends it. Yet, even so, he found himself faced with the necessity of conceiving the abstract form which is not matter, and therefore the universal which is not particular, and the ideal which is not real, exactly as all the other inquirers into the individualizing principle were. He too has to ask, how or whence is the individual? The most difficult problem, perhaps, which we meet in the Hegelian philosophy is this. When we have posited logic, or the nexus of all the categories of reality, how or whence is nature? This nature is the particular which must intervene where there is nothing but the universal. It is the incarnating of the pure ideal in matter, beginning with the simplest determination, space. It is, in short, the Aristotelian individual. And this problem in Hegel, however his own declarations in regard to it are to be taken, remains, and must remain, unsolved. There is, in fact, repeated for it, the difficulty of the Platonic idealism. The logos is the thinkability, or the thinking as a whole. There are, therefore, two alternatives. Either there is nothing else than the logos, or there is something else, but it is not thinkable, intelligible. In the first case, there is no nature outside the logos. In the second case, there is nature, but no philosophy of it. And, if the logos has been excogitated in order to understand nature, then the logos is no longer logos, or rather, no longer what it ought to be. So then, the standpoint of the logos excludes nature, and if the universality of the logos does not satisfy us, and we are athirst for actuality, for natural positiveness and particular determinateness, then there is nothing for it but to abandon the logos, to deny the idea, and indeed, Hegel himself says so. But this negation, completely analogous to the opposition of the Platonic non-being to being, the negation which the idea itself makes of itself, can have value only if it be itself a logical act, and is therefore within the sphere of the logos, and not an act which the idea, remaining within that sphere and developing the whole of its logical activity, can never fulfill. It fulfills it just when it overcomes pure logicity, and breaks through the enclosing bark of the universal, pushing itself forth as particular. Such a rupture is inconceivable. Even Hegel, then, propounds the problem of the principle of individualization without solving it. He propounds it and cannot solve it, because, if we have seen, the true concept of the dialectic, its own logos, cannot be reached as a thing thought of, or as a reality, which is a presupposition of thinking. That abstract reality, which had been already idealized by Plato into universals, or as a reality which is a presupposition of thinking. That abstract reality, which had already been idealized by Plato into universals, from which, as Aristotle clearly saw, it is impossible to redescend to the individuals of nature. By this way, then, the individual has not been, and is not to be, found, for a nature, which with its individuals is contraposed to thought, cannot be grasped.